Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started with our program. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lauren Northup, and I am the brand new Director of Engagement for Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. I'm joining you this morning from a rainy and cold Charleston, South Carolina. And I so wish that we were together in person during Americana Week, relaxing at Baker House after a busy few days at the winter show. But alas, we persevere, and we are thrilled to offer you the 5th annual Emerging Scholars Colloquium, albeit now in a virtual format. I want to say thank you to Matt Thurlow and the Decorative Arts Trust for adapting so quickly and for providing us the opportunity to highlight the research and expertise of our scholars this morning. This past year has been a transformative one for our world, but also for classical American homes. We tip our hats to Margise Howell and Peter Kenny, and we wish them well in their retirement. Under the leadership of Robert Leith, our new president, we are charging ahead into 2021 to fulfill Mr. Jenrette's unique vision for classical American homes. Robert has assembled a stellar team of subject matter experts, 2 of whom you will hear from this morning. And we have all hit the ground running with diverse mission-driven projects across all of our sites. I wanted to tell you a little bit about our major projects for 2021. Those include moving our administrative headquarters to Air Mount in Hillsborough, North Carolina. North Carolina, of course, is Mr. Jenrette's home state and the place where the trust was born in 1993. We are looking forward to partnering with both the Decorative Arts Trust and the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art, particularly the Institute's Bunny Mellon curricula in landscape architecture and design at Edgewater. We are currently working hard behind the scenes on launching a cutting-edge web presence, an educational podcast and video series, and reimagined social media channels so that we can better and more easily communicate with you. Preservation was, of course, always central to Mr. Jenrette's vision for classical American homes. In the past few months, our newly formed preservation team has begun the exciting work of investigating and documenting the historic stable at Millford. You will hear much more about that project from Jeff Klee shortly, but please be on the lookout for a short video we put together highlighting the stable project. I will put a link to that video in the chat for anyone who would like to watch it, and Carrie will also send it out to all participants to review later. So with that, I will hand over the program to Carrie from the Decorative Arts Trust, who will introduce our speakers. And thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. I can't wait till we can be together again during another amazing Americana Week. It is my pleasure to introduce our first 2 presenters this morning. And to begin with, we're going to be hearing from Mary Fesak. Mary is pursuing a PhD in American Civilization at the University of Delaware. Her dissertation research examines class, race, gender, and power structures during the late 19th and early 20th centuries through the lens of American thoroughbred breeding and training landscapes, as well as the relationship between owners, workers, and horses in the early racing industry. Mary holds a master's degree in historic preservation from Clemson and the College of Charleston, as well as a double major in history and historic preservation from the University of Mary Washington. We're so excited to share her research. And after we hear from Mary, Jeff Klee is going to be sharing his work with us. Jeff is currently the Vice President and Senior Director of Architecture for the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust. For the previous 16 years, he was an architectural historian for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. His research focuses on American architecture from the colonial era to the Civil War, and he has published essays on buildings from Boston to Savannah. Jeff has degrees from Yale and the University of Delaware, where he completed his dissertation on Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood. We are thrilled to share both of these incredible scholars And without further ado, I turn it over to Mary.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be joining you all from Wilmington, Delaware. This is my presentation on elite Northern horse culture in South Carolina. Horse culture played a vital role in elite Southern society during the antebellum period. In addition to serving as a form of transportation, expensive carriages drawn by fine horses and driven by liveried enslaved men showcased owners' wealth, taste, and status. Similarly, hunting on horseback provided Southern men with the opportunity to demonstrate their masculinity in front of their peers through their horsemanship and sportsmanship. Horse racing was also essential to the construction of elite white Southern masculinity. Planters spent large sums of money on breeding and maintaining racehorses and gambled extravagantly with their peers to prove their honor and manliness. All of these forms of horse culture reinforced planters' elite status, but were dependent on the expertise and talent of enslaved Black men who not only cared for the horses, but were also their predominant trainers and jockeys. Few tangible remains of antebellum Southern horse culture have survived to the present, aside from some carriages and stables. Architecturally, the Millford stable embodies the significance of horses in maintaining the race, class, and gender hierarchies of Southern plantation society. Following the Civil War, a lesser known but equally vibrant horse culture developed in South Carolina during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is this horse culture I will be focusing on during my talk today. This horse culture was also equally centered on the production of race, class, and gender, as Northern Gilded Age elites and their descendants developed winter retreats in towns like Aiken and Camden and bought up former plantations that had fallen into disrepair. First, I will discuss the development of Gilded Age horse culture in the North before I talk about the elites' motives in establishing winter retreats in South Carolina and the equine landscapes they developed. Newly rich Northerners viewed equestrian sports as one of the ways to cement their social status. Families like the Whitneys, Vanderbilts, Belmonts, and DuPonts generated massive fortunes during the Industrial Revolution, far exceeding the wealth of earlier American elites, including Southern planters. They looked to Europe, particularly the British, for role models on how to establish themselves as aristocrats. Many Gilded Age elites found the concept of British country estates compelling because country houses enabled them to withdraw their families from the pollution and perceived immorality of industrializing cities, while simultaneously obscuring their direct roles in the exploitation of natural resources and the working classes. In addition to George Vanderbilt's Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, members of the Whitney, Vanderbilt, and Belmont families initially constructed estates on Long Island, while the DuPonts built estates in the Brandywine Valley like Winneter and Nemours. Horse-loving members of these families replicated the British gentry in making thoroughbred racing, fox hunting, horse showing, and coaching central components of their social season, where they could conspicuously display their wealth and status. Polo also became a popular sport after Thomas Hitchcock Sr., and August Belmont Jr. organized one of the first American polo matches on Long Island in 1876. In addition to solidifying their class status, equestrian sports also served Gilded Age elites' gendered performances. During the late 19th century, American birth rates declined, divorces increased as they became more socially acceptable, a rising Black middle class challenged racial hierarchies, millions of non-English speaking immigrants arrived in cities and towns, and labor unrest grew increasingly militant. White middle and upper class Americans increasingly worried about race and class wars. By 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt called race suicide, or the failure of wealthy white Protestant Americans to reproduce in numbers equal to immigrants, the country's most pressing issue. Elite men like Roosevelt worried that Victorian domesticity and an increasingly sedentary lifestyle were eroding white American masculinity, and they embraced the fitness culture during the late 19th century. Horseback riding became a central part of elite fitness regimens, including Roosevelt's. In addition to playing polo and fox hunting, many elite horsemen, including Thomas Hitchcock Sr., F. Ambrose Clark, and Pete Bostwick, began to train and race their own thoroughbreds in dangerous and sometimes even deadly steeplechase races over obstacles to prove their manliness. The equestrian sports were not an exclusively male endeavor. The gradual loosening of gender norms and the invention of new technologies made riding horses side saddle a considerably safer and more respectable activity for elite women by the mid to late 19th century. These side saddle technologies included the invention of the leaping horn in the 1830s to physically hold women in the saddle, the safety stirrup in the 1850s to prevent the rider's feet from getting caught, the safety skirt in 1875 to safely detach in the event of a fall, preventing the rider from being dragged, and the invention of the balance girth in 1880 to stabilize unbalanced side saddles. Many of the same white supremacists and proponents of fitness culture advocated for elite women to exercise by riding, believing that it would increase women's robustness and improve their ability to bear healthy children. Elite women's respectability as horsewomen hinged on their observance of social norms. Elite women could drive carriages, fox hunt, and show horses while riding side saddle during the late 19th century, but they could not play polo or race horses because these activities were fundamental to the creation of an elite white masculine horse culture and were categorized as dangerous. The bicycle craze of the 1890s demonstrated that women could straddle moving objects without damaging their reproductive organs, contributing to the gradual acceptance of women riding astride among elites. In 1901, a group of elite New York equestrians, including Thomas Hitchcock Sr.'s wife, Louise, and John Jacob Astor IV's wife, Ava, banded together and decided to make riding astride and women's polo fashionable by starting a cross-riding women's polo club. Despite the women's social clout, riding astride was slower to gain popularity in the broader Northern horse culture. For example, the National Horse Show at Madison Square Garden did not allow women to compete riding astride until 1915, and elite women continued to have to gauge the propriety of competing astride based on their male judges' values and whether their female competitors were riding side saddle or astride well into the 1920s. Women still could not ride as jockeys, except in a handful of informal ladies' races until the 1960s. In addition to challenging gender norms in riding, Louise Hitchcock was also largely responsible for introducing Long Island's high society to Aiken, South Carolina. As a child, her family had wintered at Aiken's health resorts in the 1870s and 1880s. After marrying Thomas Hitchcock in 1891, Louise persuaded him to spend the winter in Aiken. Thomas Hitchcock was quickly struck by Aiken's mild winter climate and sandy soil, viewing it as the ideal location for a winter sporting retreat or winter colony. The following winter, the Hitchcocks invited their friend William C. Whitney to Aiken. Like Thomas Hitchcock, Whitney recognized Aiken's potential for wintertime fox hunting, polo, and racehorse training. The two men developed larger winter estates, complete with sporting facilities like stables and squash courts during the 1890s. They quickly worked to improve Aiken's infrastructure to attract other Gilded Age elites, developing the Palmetto Golf Club and tennis facilities at the Aiken Club. In 1898, Hitchcock and Whitney jointly purchased 8,000 acres of forested land to use for riding, carriage driving, fox hunting, horse showing, and steeplechasing. The Hitchcock's descendants preserved over 2,000 acres at the core of Hitchcock Woods for sporting. It remains one of the largest urban forests in the country. Thomas Hitchcock also led in Aiken's transformation into the country's winter polo capital and thoroughbred training center. Northerners vacationing at health resorts had played polo in a field south of town since the early 1880s. Hitchcock's boosterism attracted many of his polo teammates from Long Island, including Devereux Milburn, Skitty Von State, and Pete Bostwick. They developed numerous polo fields and polo ranches to house their horses south of town during the 1890s and early 1900s. Hitchcock also developed the Ridge Mile Track for training steeplechase horses in Hitchcock Woods and constructed 2 thoroughbred training stables within his equestrian complex. In 1895, he built a sand 5/8 mile track for training flat racing horses around the Whitney Polo Field. Several years later, Whitney purchased the track and constructed a large training complex for his racing stables after his friend Augustus Belmont got him hooked on thoroughbred racing in 1898. The development of a horse-focused winter retreat at Camden had many parallels to the rise of Aiken's winter colony. In 1884, New Yorker Frank Eldridge opened the Hobkirk Inn for northern tourists seeking a healthful winter environment. One of the tourists, a wealthy Bostonian, Rogers Barstow, partnered with Eldridge to develop a golf course at the Camden Country Club and a polo field behind the Hobkirk Inn in 1898. Barstow founded and led the Camden polo team, which regularly competed with and lost to the Aiken team, since members of the Aiken team were among the best polo players in America. During the mid-1920s, wealthy Buffalo resident Harry Kirkover attended a polo game in Camden. He liked the town's atmosphere so much that he purchased Barstow's shingle-style house designed by McKim, and White in 1926 and had it completely remodeled in the Greek Revival style. Kirkover's friend Ernest Woodward also enjoyed Camden and purchased an 1840s house across the street the following year. Kirkover and Woodward were avid fox hunters and steeplechasers. They developed the Springdale Racecourse outside of Camden in 1927 and began holding the Carolina Cup race in 1930. The Springdale Racecourse was the first European-style steeplechase course in which the entire track could be seen from a viewing area constructed in the United States. It also had stables and training tracks. The Carolina Cup attracted the country's most prominent steeplechase horse owners and trainers, including F. Ambrose Clark and Marion DuPont Scott. Clark moved his steeplechasing stable from Aiken, and Scott selected Camden as the location for her winter training stable. Realizing that the Whitney training track was becoming overcrowded with the growing number of elites who wanted to train their racehorses in Aiken, and preferring the low-keyed social atmosphere of Camden, Scott developed the Camden Training Center for training flat racers near the Springdale Racecourse in 1937. Several years later, Long Islander Fred Post led the construction of the state-of-the-art Aiken training track on his polo ranch and polo field, greatly expanding Aiken's role as a winter training center. Aiken and Camden were not the only locales to captivate Northern sportsmen during the late 19th century. Gilded Age elites from major cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Cincinnati were also drawn to the former plantations largely located in the South Carolina Lowcountry. A few individuals began purchasing former plantations and establishing hunt clubs like the Pineland Club and the Okatee Club in Jasper County during the 1880s and 1890s. Although what has sometimes been referred to as the Second Northern Invasion did not accelerate until the early 20th century. Attracted by the depressed land values and romanticized views of dilapidated plantations seen through the rose-colored lenses of the Lost Cause narrative, Northerners like Isaac Edward Emerson and Bernard Baruch bought former plantations like Arcadia and Hobcob Barony as winter sporting retreats. Although Millford is located in the South Carolina Sandhills instead of the Lowcountry, Mary Clark Thompson followed the trendiness of purchasing a plantation for a winter sporting retreat. Buying former plantations fit with the elite's desire to own country estates, but they ordinarily cost less than their owners' palatial primary estates because their owners typically viewed them as rural hunting retreats that required less sophisticated levels of finish or the immaculate park-like maintenance of the grounds. Owning former Southern plantations also tapped into the Gilded Age desire to find real or imagined connections with past American elites and to bolster their social prestige. Unlike Aiken's horse-centered sporting culture, Clark and the elites who settled in the eastern part of the state focused much of their sporting activities on hunting game birds and fishing. They also enjoyed horseback riding and informal fox hunts, but organized equestrian sports like polo, horse showing, and racing remained more popular around the South Carolina towns of Aiken and Camden. The stables constructed by Gilded Age elites during the 1890s and early 20th century differed from those built by planters in the antebellum period. Equine veterinary medicine developed as a professional field in the United States during the second half of the 19th century. Advances in equine medicine and an increasing interest in technological developments in sanitation contributed to changing equine husbandry practices, including approaches to stable architecture. Authors of late 19th and early 20th century treatises on horsekeeping repeatedly emphasized the importance of siting stables and locations with good drainage. They also stressed the importance of fresh air, adequate ventilation, and sunshine, though not too bright, within stables. Gilded Age horse people took veterinary recommendations for the health of their expensive racing, polo showing, and fox hunting horses seriously. In the mild winter climate of South Carolina, stables constructed according to these specifications frequently consisted of a single width row of stalls with doors and windows providing access directly to the outside to provide the horses with fresh air and light. A walkway spanned the fronts of the stalls, and the doors were typically sheltered by an overhanging roof, sometimes supported by a colonnade or arcade. This walkway wrapped around the stable and thoroughbred training barns to provide a sheltered space to exercise horses in inclement weather. This type of stable was called a shed row since it lacked a large center aisle. Shed row barns could be linear, L-plan, or U-plan in shape. Gilded Age elites still occasionally constructed center aisle barns, similar to the antebellum Millford stable, but stalls typically had exterior doors in addition to doors accessed by the center aisle. This was also due in part to elite horse people's fear of barn fires, consuming their entire stable of sport horses or race horses. Most shed row barns were only 1 story in height, with hay stored in a shed or in a stall. Some had a central hayloft, usually located over the tack room, and 1 or 2 stalls at the most. Many veterinarians of the period felt that hay dust falling from haylofts was damaging to horses' lungs and urged horse owners to store their hay elsewhere. Stall sizes also differed between stables constructed by Gilded Age elites and antebellum planters. There are 2 main types of stalls in the 19th century, standing stalls and box stalls. Standing stalls were just wide enough for grooms to tend the horses that stood tied in them. Some stables had systems of weights that enabled horses to lie down on the spot, but they could not turn around or move freely. Box stalls were large enough that horses could be left to move freely within them. Many early stables only had standing stalls or standing stalls with a couple of box stalls. Although stables with standing stalls continued to be used in places where space was at a premium, such as urban stables, by the late 19th century, many equine experts viewed box stalls as better for horses' physical and mental health. Gilded Age elites constructed stables with box stalls for their prized horses. The sizes of these stalls usually range from around 9.5 feet square to 12 feet square, which are small for sport horses by our contemporary standards. Stylistically, Gilded Age elites tended to favor relatively plain architecture for their South Carolina stables to match the comparatively simple Greek Revival and Colonial Revival architecture of their winter houses. The level of architectural style also depended on the location of the stable. Stables and carriage barns within house complexes frequently complemented the house and had more architectural detail than stables constructed in polo or thoroughbred training complexes located outside of residential areas. A few elites, like the Hitchcocks, constructed their South Carolina equestrian complexes loosely in the shingle style, more typical of northern estates. A few elites the majority also favored plain utilitarian wood frame stables that fit a southern aesthetic with prominent front gables and covered walkways supported by posts, echoing the pedimented porticos of their Greek Revival or Colonial Revival South Carolina homes. F. Ambrose Clark and his wife, Florence, built an exceptional barn for her racing stable in Aiken. The stable was an unusual example of a brick training barn built in the Colonial Revival style. It also had an unusual covered ring for exercising horses during inclement weather attached to the back of the building. Although these stables and equine landscapes were a space of recreation for elite horse people, they were also a source of labor for working class individuals. Many stable owners employed a labor hierarchy that reflected and reinforced broader social hierarchies in South Carolina. During this period, elite equestrians frequently hired white men for higher status roles like trainers and stable managers, and young white men as jockeys and exercise riders. They relegated African-American men who had occupied these positions during the antebellum period to lower status positions as grooms, chauffeur carriage drivers, and grounds caretakers because their skills as horsemen threatened to undermine the elite's use of riding as jockeys as a performance of class, whiteness, and masculinity. Women of all races were barred from employment in stables during this period because stable work was considered men's labor. In conclusion, the estates and winter colonies of South Carolina provided Gilded Age elites and their descendants with sporting retreats. In Aiken and Camden, elite horse people constructed extensive equestrian landscapes to support their interests in riding, driving, fox hunting, polo, horse showing, racehorse training, and steeplechase racing. Those who bought antebellum estates like Millford often built or repurposed stables and kennels to support some of these equestrian activities at a smaller scale. The sporting landscapes of South Carolina served as a space where Gilded Age elites and their children could both indulge in their love of horses and use the equestrian sports to socially perform their class, race, and gender statuses. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture today. While there are not many books related to this topic, here are a few particularly good ones that I have found useful. Ken Cohen's book discusses sporting culture, including all the gambling and betting in elite Southern society. Catherine Mooney's book is probably the best one on the elite Black jockeys and how they played into the system of slavery. And Daniel Vivian's New Plantation World talks a lot about the lost cause narrative and the creation of new kind of racial and class orders in South Carolina as elites bought up low country estates. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Mary. I think before I begin, I want to say, express a special thanks to Mary for presenting today. When I asked her to speak to us, I didn't know, and I only learned last week, in fact, that she would be right in the middle of preparing for her comprehensive exams right now. So while I'm sure she's handling that challenge more effectively than I did, it's under the best circumstances, that's a difficult and tedious time of a graduate student's life. And so that she somehow made time to speak with us today earns her a lot of extra credit with me, and I think with all of us. So special thanks to Mary for participating in the middle of her comps. I'm quite sure that she could have given us another 45 minutes on each of those books that she mentioned at the end of her talk. All right. Now, Mary has wonderfully introduced the ways in which polite forms of leisure continued to animate places like Millford well into the 20th century. Now, my putting it like this may sound a little dismissive, but I think that leisure properly belongs at the heart of the history of Millford because it is at the heart of American notions of ideal domestic life. For those who don't know the site well, Millford is an exceptional example of Greek Revival architecture. Built in 1840 and 1841 for John and Susan Hampton Manning, young newlyweds and heirs to great wealth, including this beautiful piece of property above the Wateree River in Sumter County, South Carolina. Millford is a towering achievement of antebellum American architecture, though its remoteness has meant that it is little known beyond the most devoted fans of the Greek Revival. Also surviving from the era of its construction are a porter's lodge, a pair of flanking service buildings, and a remarkable stable, the subject of my talk today. With my brief time, I want to introduce you to some of the ways that we've begun to think about the importance of the Millford stable and how it fits into the larger story of American architecture. It is much more than a handsome service building. Now, of course, it is that too, but we get no credit for making such a banal and self-evident observation. We asked Mary to speak to you today for entirely selfish reasons. We wanted to know more about this building. For many of us, it is easy to ignore such structures as entirely utilitarian, like a barn or a granary or a dairy, and of little interest to those who study architecture and the decorative arts. Recall Nicholas Pevsner's pithy definition of architecture. A bicycle shed is a building. Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. Thinking of bicycle sheds and stables as unworthy of careful attention is understandable enough if ornament, finish, and expense are how we determine what merits scholarly attention. Even though private stables are associated with the finest houses of early America, they are not ordinarily the object of much embellishment. Consider the stable at Shirley, for example, which, while finely built of Flemish bond brick and decorated with a modillion cornice, is simply a well-made brick box. The most prominent equestrian in colonial Virginia was John Taylor II, whose great mansion, Mount Airy, demonstrated his willingness to spend extravagantly on fine buildings. To indulge his passion in horse racing, Taylor built a mile-long track and a stuccoed stable near his house to shelter and breed thoroughbreds. Taylor's stable, like Charles Carter's at Shirley, is another well-built masonry box. Mary's work begins to point the way toward a deeper understanding of such buildings and helps us see why they're worthy of both special care and scholarly effort. But even according to Pevsner's narrow view of architecture, the stable at Millford commands our attention in a way that its best Virginia predecessors do not. With its resemblance to a Greek temple, its Doric colonnade, and its grand scale, it has a clear architectural relationship to the mansion house that forms the centerpiece of this compound. Though its order is Doric, while the mansion's is Corinthian, and its material is timber, where the mansion is built of brick, it is nonetheless a carefully designed and complementary work of architecture, a temple to horse racing, where its predecessors were brick barns. But whether we consider buildings to be our subject or architecture with a capital A, our question should be why? Why was this building, full of large animals and reeking of their food and their sweat and their waste, so important to John Lawrence Manning that he paid handsomely to dress it up in Greek finery? To some degree, its prominence may be a reflection of the maturation of horse racing in the southern states, as Charleston solidified its preeminence as a southern center of equestrian sports in the 1830s and 1840s. But equally, it deserves attention as a manifestation of new ideas about domestic life, about the polite home as a place of leisure, a place from which work and all signs of work were banished. Urban historians relate this phenomenon to the rise of the suburbs in the middle of the 19th century, a period that increasingly saw middle-class Americans set up house at the edges of cities. They were encouraged to relocate by a new commuting infrastructure on the one hand, and on the other, an emergent sense of the house as a sanctified space, a place that needed to be set apart from the toil and bustle of urban commercial centers with their corrosive, corrupting influence. Do not mistake my meaning. Millford is not convenient to anything, even today. It was not built as a suburban house, but as a country villa, a mansion with aristocratic pretensions intended as a rural retreat for John Lawrence Manning and his young bride. By car, it is about an hour from Columbia, South Carolina, and a bit more from Charleston. The modern marvels of fast internet service and asphalt paved roads have not yet penetrated as far as this part of Sumter County. Today, it is surrounded by property that is managed for timber. In the 1840s, this was agricultural land, but Millford itself was not a plantation, though this name has sometimes been applied to it in the modern era. Millford was a country house, not a working farm. The 1850 federal census returns for Sumter County list only 27 enslaved people in the household of John L. Manning. 8 of them were children, aged 10 or younger. The 19 adults were likely a combination of domestic staff and people caring for the horses in the estate. The wealth that enabled Millford did not come out of the ground around it. It came instead from hundreds of miles away. The Mannings owned 2 sugar plantations in Louisiana that were farmed by around 1,000 enslaved people and managed by hired intermediaries. The source of their wealth, in other words, and the brutal toil required to extract it from sugarcane was far out of sight. The remoteness of the property is likely the reason that such an abundance of documentation survives during the years the house was being built and furnished. Construction specifications, correspondence, floor plans, and furniture orders all document an intensive, obsessive, long-distance construction effort. The builder and designer was Nathaniel Potter, a Rhode Island native who had come to Charleston during the building boom of the 1830s. In addition to floor plans of the mansion, Potter's correspondence with Manning includes detailed information about the stable. Most of this is technical in nature, regarding the dimensions of the building, the size of principal structural members, and the injunction that even the largest of these, at 53 feet long, not be spliced together, but be a single continuous timber. There are few instructions regarding the appearance of the exterior. What is specified suggests an easy familiarity with the classical language of architecture. The columns, for example, were to be Doric and fluted in the most approved manner, a direction that clearly indicates that they were to be of the Greek rather than Roman Doric. Though the pitch of the roof is not specified, it was built low in the fashion of a Greek temple, a design choice that required a change of material in the roof covering. Specified by Potter as first quality cypress, the stylish angle of the roof was poorly suited to wood shingles, so the builders chose instead to install the relatively novel modern tin covering that was specified for the flat roof of the mansion house. The specs provide useful information about how the interior of the stable was laid out and used. Stalls were to be the width of a joist bay, roughly 5 feet, with a post defining the front of each one and supporting the heavier joists above. Though in this period, some English breeders were starting to recommend building larger stalls that permitted horses to move more freely and to lie down, those at Millford were built as narrower standing stalls. This view shows a pair of standing stalls that survived a later reconfiguration. There was also to be a separate carriage house, a harness room, and a granary on the ground floor, all of which had plaster ceilings to prevent dust and dirt from falling through the floorboards above. The granary and the harness room, additionally, were walled in with plank, finished on both sides by hand planing to provide a smooth surface. The harness room and carriage house were the rooms in the crossing part of the stable, accessible through enormous doors. 10 windows illuminated the interior, with so-called circular windows in the gables. This 5,000 square foot, state-of-the-art structure served the Mannings well for decades. And when the widow Mary Clark Thompson purchased it in 1902, she needed only to make a handful of changes to make it suitable for modern needs. Her principal change was to convert the standing stalls to larger boxes, doubling the width for each animal and cutting the number of horses that the building could accommodate in half. Mrs. Thompson was an enthusiastic rider of carriages and merits further attention as part of the wave of wealthy Northerners purchasing Southern estates as hunting preserves. Among her many achievements, she was one of the principal benefactors of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as an entirely gratuitous aside, I find it fascinating that our 2 South Carolina houses were owned by sponsors of New York's 2 great art museums, the Met and the Guggenheim. Carefully thought out as the stable was, as well as the kitchen and the laundry, the mansion house came in for still more painstaking treatment. Following the instruction of the Mannings, Nathaniel Potter's specifications delineated the precise pattern book models for each door casing, and the source of the portico capitals in the Choragic monument of Lysicrates, famous among classicists as the first use of the Corinthian order in the ancient world. Between 1840 and 1844, Manning placed 4 orders for furniture from Duncan Fife & Son in New York, and remarkably, over 50 of those objects remain in the house today, including this bedstead. With their orders for Greek furniture and their care to use only the most approved antique models for their buildings, the Mannings worked hard and spent lavishly to make their entire domestic ensemble as refined and cosmopolitan as money could buy in the 1840s. These documents and the surviving buildings and furnishings together tell a story of a remarkable commitment to building both a home and a work of art. What the Mannings and Potter and Duncan Fife sought to create at Millford approaches what Richard Wagner called the Gesamtkunstwerk, or the complete work of art, in which every object, every building, and every part of the landscape contributes to a coherent, carefully controlled aesthetic whole. We tend to think of such overwhelming, obsessive attention to the last detail as a creation of the modern era, a dream of William Morris, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Walter Gropius. But here it is, a young couple of great means creating a house and its environment out of whole cloth in rural Sumter County in the 1840s. More egalitarian moderns might scoff at the aristocratic pretension of it all, but it is an exceptional work of art. It is also a commitment to and a celebration of a certain kind of domesticity. I say a certain kind of domesticity, and I might have said a certain kind of Southern domesticity, characterized by deference and enslavement. Recall the enslaved population of 27 people housed in service buildings. Recall that there are no purpose-built slave quarters here, no field hands, and no large-scale farming of the property. The source of the Mannings' wealth is hundreds of miles away on sugar plantations in Louisiana. As with the Gesamtkunstwerk, Millford is also modern in the sense that the disagreeable parts of what made it possible were so far out of sight, they were in another state. The Mannings removed themselves from even the sight and sounds of heavy labor to perfect a leisured ideology of home. This separation of work from home demands attention in its own right, but for now it is enough to say that it was a long process, one that began in the early 18th century and one that continues into the present, viral interruptions notwithstanding. As part of the Manning's domestic ensemble, the stable is not only a temple to horse racing, it is also a temple to contemporary ideas of home. Millford is a retreat from the plantation and the city, from places of work, for the Mannings and later for the Clarks. Like other exceptional houses of its period, it allows us to see more clearly and more fully how Americans conceptualized ideal domesticity as a place where labor was excluded and leisure made sacred. We make a mistake if we imagine this as a world entirely distinct from our own, as a product of chattel slavery or of archaic attitudes about gender, class, or wealth. The notions of house and home that Millford and its exceptional stable enshrine still inform the ways in which we live and work and build today. With all that said, we're only just beginning our investigation of the stable and of Millford generally. Our efforts to date have focused on documenting its roof, but we will soon begin exploring its frame and early form on the ground floor. Mary's research has given us a great head start because it allows us to connect the history of equestrian sports to the history of American domesticity in ways that help us take the story of the stable from the 1840s into the early 20th century and relate them to the present. So many thanks to Mary for sharing her wonderful research, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Mary. That was fascinating. And we have a few questions coming in. Everybody who is watching as a participant now, please feel free to ask any questions that you have for our presenters today in the chat. We will have a Q&A at the end of our presentations. So we are moving on with two more great presentations. The first is from Alexandra Cade. Alexandra is a senior curator and director of Woodwind Studies at the Sigal Music Museum in Greenville, South Carolina. A native of Philadelphia, Alexandra attended the Winterthur program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware, where she studied historic soundscapes and the intersections between amateurism and craftsmanship in 19th century American pianos. In addition to her time at Winterthur, Alexandra served as the apprentice harpsichord maker to Colonial Williamsburg and has completed archival and research fellowships at the Canterbury Shaker Village and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts Summer Institute. After Allie gives her presentation, Grant Quertermous will give a presentation. Grant is the curator and director of collections for Classical American Homes Preservation Trust, a position he has held since August 2020. He was previously the curator of Tudor Place Historic House and Garden, a National Historic Landmark property in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where he spent 5 years researching its residents and their families' ties to George and Martha Washington. Prior to his arrival at Tudor Place in 2015, he was the assistant curator of collections at James Madison's Montpelier, where he worked for nearly 9 years. He holds a BS in history from Murray State University and an MA in anthropology with a concentration in historical archaeology from the University of South Carolina. So without further ado, I welcome Alexandra to share her lecture with everyone.
All right, thank you so much, Carrie. I'm so excited to be here and partnering with Grant for this. It's been really great. So, all right, I'll go ahead and get started. On a summer evening in the mid-18th century, Prince Frederick II of Prussia prepared to host a concert in the music room of Sanssouci Palace, his summer estate outside of Berlin. An accomplished flute player and student of composition, the prince held frequent evenings of chamber music, joined by his court of fine musicians and composers. Armed with his ebony two-key transverse flute, a highly popular instrument for wealthy gentlemen throughout the 18th century, the prince was often accompanied by C.P.E. Bach on the Gottfried Silbermann forte piano. Both instruments are still extant in the palace collections. Nearly a century later, German painter Adolf Menzel illustrated one of Prince Frederick's famous concertscapes. Illuminated by a gentle glow, we are pulled into the transcendental aura of the room. Closing your eyes, it's easy to imagine the rich textures of the ensemble, the silvery tones of the prince's flute vaulting high above, the honeyed bows of the strings, or the persistence of the piano. Perhaps they're playing a work by Quantz, C.P.E. Bach, or even a composition by the prince himself. The dynamic nature of the painting brings the ethereal evening to life, allowing the audiences both inside and outside the image to experience the fervor of the music. But if we look closer, we begin to notice parts of the music making that are so often ignored, overshadowed by the beauty of instruments and their sounds. In order to play that summer evening, Prince Frederick, along with violinists and violists, would have adjusted their music stands to the perfect stature. C.P.E. Bach at the piano and Quantz on the cello's continuo would have settled into their respective chairs, likely favored for their height and comfort. All would have positioned their candles to best read the music, conveniently placed in dedicated perches built directly into the music stands. And when the concert came to a close, Prince Frederick and the string players would have tucked their instruments into the safety of their cases, cleaned and ready to be played again. Musical instruments survive as some of the most dynamic, decorative, and personal pieces of material culture. When we study a harpsichord, guitar, or clarinet today, its craftsmanship, ornament, and ownership are only part of the story. Though an intangible part of material culture, the sound is truly what defines these objects. So what if an instrument can't be played? What does it become? Is it a piece of furniture? Is it a sculpture? While every object can be discussed through the lens of human functionality and ergonomics, it's an especially important conversation to have when considering musical instruments and their accessories. Their ability to make sound is inherent to their purpose, and they're intimately entangled with the people, their collaborators, to create music. But it's not just the instruments that are so instrumental in this process. And I will note, this presentation primarily focuses on the instrumental traditions of European art music throughout American history. And access to these traditions was heavily limited to white, middle, and upper class families. And access to the education and performance of classical music remains very limited today. But beyond Americanized iterations of European art music, there are countless and diverse musical customs belonging to communities across America that are equally as critical to the story of music in this country. These objects that I'm mentioning today were often very expensive, made of luxury materials, inaccessible to many, and not representative of musical traditions for a large portion of those living in the United States, both by choice or by force. While still an understudied realm of the field, extant research of the material culture of music has primarily focused on musical instruments and printed or manuscript sheet music. But so many other objects, chairs, stands, canterburies, cases, lighting equipment, have been too often eclipsed in scholarship and exhibition. Before I focus on chairs, though, I did want to give a brief overview of some of the pieces of material culture most important to musicians of the past and the present. Any instrumental musician knows that the position of your chair or the height of your stand makes a vital difference in the experience of performance. All of these particulars can be in danger of sounding a bit trivial, but playing an instrument is a highly physical dance of practice and precise movements. Accessories too low or too high can erode your musicianship. At best, your posture is on your mind throughout the entire piece. At worst, your entire ability to play is compromised. And as a violist, I know this has happened to me many times. Stands are essential to the player when using sheet music and not performing from memory. For instrumentalists playing either seated or standing, a music stand must be able to reflect the individual's physicality and height. Functioning both as a perch for light and a shelf for pieces of music, the stand had to be sturdy enough to support the weight of candlesticks and wide enough to put multiple pages of music side by side. And of course, most importantly, their height could be adjusted. Sometimes music stands were even more specialized in form, with the creation of choral stands with room for multiple manuscripts underneath, stands for the wide books of shape note singing, and chamber music stands would have enough space for an entire string quartet. Cases are incredibly personal objects, and the following are just a few examples out of the over 100 cases that we have at the Sigal Music Museum collection. It's the primary line of protection for a musical instrument, with carefully shaped slots lined in a plush textile to hold everything in place. With various pockets and nooks inside, cases hold accessories for musical instrument maintenance. Reeds for winds, rosin for strings, but they're also the repository for other small personal valuables. Sometimes they're made specifically for the instrument held inside, and sometimes they could be purchased separately or in conjunction with the instrument. And aesthetically, they could be highly ornate, very plain. In the past, cases were made with a variety of materials, including wood, leather, and textile. One of my favorites in the collection is a really rare flute case, which is in the form of a book, and it's meant to be tucked right into a library shelf. Now, it goes without saying that musical instruments can be played without a special type of chair. For most of human history, people have had to play musical instruments across the globe without seats specific to music making. So what does it take for a chair to function in the context of performance? The requirements need to check a few boxes. They generally need to be armless as to not get in the way of your elbows, and it's best when they have a firm but comfortable upholstery. Of course, for certain instruments, the ability to play is not tied to a chair at all, but for musicians like the keyboard player, the pedal harpist, the cellist, or the bassoonist, a seat is a necessity. But what can make them better? Adjustability. Just like a music stand, a chair works best when it can reflect and conform to the physical needs of its user. Chairs specific to the performance of musical instruments stem from a burgeoning industry created by the rise of domestic music making for white, middle, and upper class American families across Europe and North America. As more families had access to instruments for their homes, a greater range of people of different sizes, ages, and physicalities needed the right setup to properly use their instruments. The musical instrument seat, sometimes called a piano stool, sometimes called a music stool, was a specialty form of furniture that appears around the turn of the 19th century and continues to grow in demand for the next 100 years. Like any form, there are variations, but most fill a particular set of criteria. They have a low or no back, diminutive or no arms, and a sturdy base, often with 3 or 4 legs stemming out. But most importantly, these stools are adjustable with a large threaded screw centering the seat. Production of music stools in the early 19th century catered to the masses of young women who sought to become fluent in the language of accomplishments, which encompassed art, needlework, foreign language, and music. In the 18th century, these topics were often taught by itinerant tutors or within small groups. But in the first decades of the 19th century, education was reformed, particularly for girls, resulting in abundance of formal female academies, in addition to the itinerant tutors. These schools tried to strike a balance between feminine accomplishments and academic subjects that had been previously mostly taught to men. And regardless of the increase in general academies, the social expectations for these accomplishments, particularly musical instruments, continue to guide the lives of young ladies. For women, this domestic musical involvement typically translated to the piano, the pedal harp, guitar, or vocal performance. And I will note men also play these instruments, but they had additional socially accepted alternatives such as the flute, the clarinet, violin, many more, but those are just some of the more popular ones. But competence on an instrument for both genders gave way to a social performance of co-ed interaction and collaboration. And there's often a misconception that women absolutely never played instruments like the flute, violin, or cello. Some did, but it was certainly much less common. For some, musical endeavors with the piano or pedal harp were simply a subject to learn, fulfilling expectations for parents or society. For others, it opened a world of agency over their time, their soundscapes, and emotional expression. That's the beauty of a musical instrument and what makes them such a dynamic part of material culture. They're an extension of the person performing. And armed with the right setup between their music stool and their instrument, 19th century women could harness musical agency to the best of their abilities. As a convenient and adjustable form, the music stool could, of course, serve a variety of needs within the household, and similar forms are sometimes even pictured at a vanity, as seen on the image on the left. And past scholarship has even referred to them as such. But it's really in front of the pianos and the pedal harps that the music stool takes its most consequential role. In the United States, the square piano is an instrument that changed the scope of domestic music making. Invented in England, but adopted and revolutionized by American artisans despite falling out of favor in Europe in the early 19th century, the square piano became an American phenomenon and altered the landscape of parlors across the country until after the Civil War. As piano technology improved, the instruments grew larger, heavier, and louder, also increasing capabilities in sound and expression through the addition of pedals. The pedal harp was also an important instrument in the privileged 19th century household. Embodying the aesthetics of the neoclassical movements, the harp provided a direct link to antiquity in the instruments of ancient Greece, like the lyre. Coaxing a competent sound out of a harp had a steeper learning curve than the piano, requiring specialized equipment and instruction that wasn't quite as widespread. Education on the piano or pedal harp often began during childhood. When one begins to learn an instrument, one of the most important things is the physical setup, preparing the student to craft the muscle memory for competent performance and to prevent injury. Traveling teachers for both of these instruments could be found in cities up and down the coastline, but they were also making their ways inland as infrastructure strengthened and new communities grew, especially along the Great Wagon Road and westward towards Kentucky and Tennessee. Besides selling their time and expertise, many also joined in the market of selling musical accessories. As you can see, the teacher on the right is selling piano stools as well. And as I mentioned before, female academies also taught these instruments, usually for an extra fee per semester. While we can't speak to educators from the early 19th century to hear their pedagogical plans, we can examine pedagogy books for guidance. These can't entirely take the place of an in-person teacher, but they can provide insight into the particulars of proper form and how critical the music stool is to the performance of an instrument. Published in London by famed English composer and maker Muzio Clementi in 1801 was his Introduction to the Art of Playing the Pianoforte. One of the earliest manuals for piano instruction, he asserts that the hand and arm should be held at a horizontal position, neither depressing or raising the wrist. The seat should therefore be adjusted accordingly. The fingers and thumb should be placed over the keys, always ready to strike, bending the fingers in more or less in proportion to their length. All unnecessary motion must be avoided. Looking at another pedagogy book for the piano, this one written slightly later in 1826 by Philadelphia music merchant, composer, and teacher Benjamin Carr, was his practical instructor for the pianoforte. In the beginning chapter, he makes a note on setup saying, "It is now necessary to mention that the pupil must sit before the pianoforte sufficiently elevated to permit the hand and arm to form such a direct line that the fingers, when curved, will permit the ends of them to press the keys, and particular care must be taken that the wrists do not sink down." Now, printing that last part of the paragraph in capital letters, it's easy to imagine your own grade school piano teacher scolding you for sinking your wrist down. As Carr notes that the image on the cover of his instructor is an example of appropriate form, it's easy to see the vital role that the piano stool plays in producing the correct setup. The young lady was able to adjust her stool to the perfect height to fit her body and the instrument, allowing her arms to be just parallel with the keyboard, heeding both Carr's and Clementi's instruction. And though we can't see it directly, the second image also likely highlights the effects of a well-adjusted piano stool, giving Emily here the perfect posture and wrist position to perform on her Firth and Hall square piano. Turning to the pedal harp, we're looking at one of the early pedagogical texts, the first 6 weeks, daily precepts and examples for the harp by celebrated harpist N.C. Boscia. Just like the piano, the position of the body is critically important to the physical setup of the harp. Boscia addresses the music stool directly, saying the elevation of the music stool must be so suited the height of the performer's figure as to bring the lower part of his face upon a level with the neck of the instrument, while the feet are so stationed on either side of the pedestal as to them an easy and graceful command of the pedals. And I also will note that I think it's particularly interesting that Bosch's text addresses a male player, but the image that he includes are featuring women. Because instruction began early for younger girls, children's feet could not always reach the pedals of either the harp or the piano. Bosch's manual in particular recognizes this issue, saying juvenile practitioners whose feet will not reach the ground without their being seated too low to command the strings with ease may place them lightly on the pedals as a resting place. But the more proper convenience for young performers will be that of using a smaller instrument. Now, this problem is really well illustrated in this 1826 print of the musical infant sisters, who are both sitting on top of their respective music stools. And as you can see, they cannot reach the pedals of their respective instruments. But it does appear that both of them have some sort of extension reaching up from the pedals that is allowing it to work for these young girls. However, these smaller harps did exist, offered in this 1832 advertisement in the Pennsylvania Gazette for pedal harps, which says they are selling one small harp for the use of young ladies from the age of 10 to 15 years. While perfect to meet the needs of a growing young lady, the music stool also enabled a congenial relationship with the piano within a home, making it rapidly accessible to more than one person. For families sharing instruments between multiple players, the music stool was a perfect tool for flexibility between siblings, parents, and guests. Individual music stools also accommodated for the new and exciting works and arrangements for four-hand piano becoming popular in the early 19th century, requiring two players to sit side by side at one instrument. The execution of these works sometimes had romantic and sexual undertones, allowing the two players to be in extremely close proximity, sometimes crossing arms over the other as guided by the music, which you can see in the picture on the right. The music stools dealt with different heights between players, putting them on an even level of physical comfort to produce the most competent recital, therefore contributing to the social performance of this musical flirtation. And I apologize, I was only able to find a version of the piece on the right, on the left with a watermark, but it's a great example of two music stools side by side for a four-hand work. This sheet music, pedagogy manuals, and the instruments themselves were sold at music stores across the country, usually domestically made pianos and often imported harps. Though they weren't crafted together with the instrument, music merchants often advertised the music stools right along with all the other accessories. So stools were also advertised, of course, by people operating as furniture dealers and upholsterers, speaking to the wide range of options available for the purchase of a music stool. The ad on the right is particularly interesting as it lists the various types of designs available, including plain, carved, square, and round high back. The options in piano stool design emphasize the desire for the stool to have some uniformity with the piano, if possible. Though they weren't crafted by the piano makers, many stools were made to precisely match the ornament or carving that is seen on the legs of the piano. So in this image, you see that the piano has the same cross-cut diamond patterns as the piano legs. This one has the same spiral fluted design. And this one has the same sort of thick lobed pattern. So sometimes these stools would even have an embroidered seat cover, which serves as yet another point of interaction between a woman and her instrument. Accomplishing this type of craft was advertised by needlework instructors, again, highlighting the wide reach of needlework. These are some of the examples of piano stools that are actually in the collection of the Sigal Music Museum, which I've been trying to take stock of as my colleagues and I have been working through to organize our holdings. Here are a few more from our collection, late 19th century likely. I especially enjoy the variety of styles and ornament, like this wrought iron example on the left, the ball and claw, which has a glass marble on the foot. And I'm really looking forward to doing more research on these since realizing how many we have tucked around is actually what inspired this entire topic and lecture in the first place. As the 19th century went on, demand for music stools continued to grow, resulting in companies like George Archer, based in Rochester, New York, to specialize in forms of the music stool by the last quarter of the 19th century. And really, there's so many out there. If you poke your head around your own collection, you might find one lurking near one of your square pianos. I think there's some really understated importance of piano stools. They really accentuate the trajectory of the domestic piano in 19th century America and allow us to tell a more broad story of the physicality and accessibility of musical instrument performance. So all this is really just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm really excited to see where I can go with this from here. But I will end with that today and pass things on to Grant. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Allie. I am going to now, let me get things ready to share my screen here. And you brought up some great things to consider when looking at decorative arts objects associated with musical performance. And I will say that, I think our conversations have certainly influenced the way I've been thinking about the music stools that I'm going to discuss in just a moment here. Let me get things ready. So this afternoon, I'm going to discuss one of my current projects, which focuses on a group of music stools attributed to New York cabinet maker Duncan Phyfe. The project actually came about, like many projects do, when I began looking at one of these music stools in our collection at Edgewater, the classical American homes property on New York's Hudson River Valley. Oh, let me switch to presentation mode here. Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. But before I discuss my research on this group of seating furniture, I wanted to highlight a few of the musical instruments and related furniture in the classical American homes collection, such as the Kirkland's family piano at Airmount. Allie, as I said, brought up some great things to consider when looking at furniture and musical instruments. And it's got me thinking about how we present this piano within the context of the historic house. Moving a little further north up to Edgewater, as I said, located in Dutchess County, New York, along the Hudson River, another such object is Susan Gaston Donaldson's pedal harp by London harp maker Alexander Berry. It's an important object associated with Edgewater that classical American homes founder Dick Jenrette was able to locate and return to the house more than 100 years after it left, following Susan's death in the 1860s. Susan and her husband Robert were the mid-19th century owners of Edgewater, and her harp is one of several important objects in the collection there that helps us interpret their ownership. Susan's harp is displayed in the morning room, and just over there, you see it in the corner, and just above the harp is this portrait of Susan, completed in 1832 by artist George Cook, on long-term loan from the Brooklyn Museum collection. In the portrait, you can see Susan's harp just over her shoulder. Cook depicts Susan in the drawing room of the Donaldsons' Manhattan residence at 15 State Street, overlooking the Battery where they lived at that time in New York City. And the inclusion of the harp wasn't just purely for show, as Susan was a very talented and skilled musician on several instruments. When Fredrika Bremer, the Swedish feminist reformer, visited the Donaldsons in 1849, she recalled her impression of one of Susan's performances, saying Mrs. D played the harp and piano and sang remarkably well with extraordinary power, like a real musician, which I believe is a rare thing in this country. Now, another object associated with Susan and her music at Edgewater is the Donaldson's Canterbury by Duncan Phyfe. As a piece of furniture, the original intended purpose of the Canterbury, with its divided compartments, was for the storage of music books and sheet music. The Donaldson's Canterbury is made of rosewood veneer, mahogany, and features gilded faux brass inlay and melon-reeded feet, which matches a suite of furniture also by Duncan Phyfe used by the Donaldsons. The Grecian couch, a sofa, and 2 window seats from that suite are also extant, and several of these pieces are also displayed in the morning room at Edgewater. The canterbury is on brass casters, and when not in use during the period, it was typically rolled under the piano for storage. Now, the object which I'm going to focus on for the rest of my presentation is a small music stool attributed to Duncan Phyfe that's also found in the morning room at Edgewater, adjacent to those other objects, except it doesn't share the Donaldson provenance of these earlier objects. This stool was acquired by Dick Jenrette in the third quarter of the 20th century, but I'll discuss more about its provenance in just a moment. The music stool is actually part of a group of at least 3 identical stools. A second example, seen at center, is in the collection at Winterthur. That stool was purchased by museum founder Henry Francis DuPont and is found in the Phyfe room. A third stool is part of the Stanley Weiss collection of Providence, Rhode Island. Music stools, as Allie discussed, are an interesting yet understudied category of seating furniture in American decorative arts. I should also mention that I'm purposefully calling them music stools for this presentation rather than piano stools, because as Allie mentioned, they can be used for a variety of playing a variety of instruments, such as the pedal harp, such as the image you see here of Eliza Ridgely with her pedal harp. And you can see just a little hint of her music stool there slightly behind her. Again, it's a fairly specialized seating form, but one that offers some advantages over simply pulling a chair up to the piano keyboard, namely the ability to adjust the height of the seat. All of these stools feature a screw mechanism that allows the round seat to be raised above the frame, allowing the user to place themselves at that proper height Allie discussed to be able to play the instrument correctly. So let's talk about the attribution. The name Duncan Phyfe is easily one of the most recognizable names in American decorative arts. Active from 1792 until his retirement in 1847, Phyfe defined classical New York furniture to the point that today his name has become an adjective to describe a particular style of American furniture. The products of Phyfe's shop have been the subject of numerous books and exhibitions. The first, a section of the Hudson Fulton Celebration exhibit in 1909, this exhibit at the Met in 1922, and most recently the 2012 exhibition, Duncan Phyfe, Master Cabinet Maker in New York, also at the Met. Phyfe's work is found in numerous museum collections, and his sofas, pier tables, and lyre-back chairs are highly collectible and still command top prices at auctions and antique shows. The Classical American Homes collection has approximately 230 examples of furniture attributed to Duncan Phyfe, several of which you see on the screen here. As the curators of the 2012 Met exhibit noted in their accompanying catalog, Phyfe employed a sizable force of master craftsmen, journeymen, and apprentices, as well as carvers, turners, and upholsterers. He also took advantage of a wide network of subcontractors and suppliers, so his business was very much an early factory approach to furniture production. So let me pose a question. Is there evidence that Duncan Phyfe's shop was producing music stools? Well, I'm going to actually answer my own question here and say yes. You only have to look at some of the extant invoices from Phyfe's shop, such as this one made out to New York merchant James Kelso, to see the evidence. The February 1813 invoice shows that Phyfe billed Kelso $25 for one piano stool. Now, the charge of $25 is interesting when you compare it to other pieces of furniture noted on the same invoice, to put it in perspective. The piano stool is more expensive than the pair of footstools that you see above it, but the work table made for Mrs. Kelso, which is at the bottom of this invoice, was actually more than double the price of the piano stool. Several years later, in 1816, Phyfe charged another New Yorker, James Brinkerhoff, $3 for covering a piano stool, but this suggests that rather than fabricating a new piece of furniture, this was simply a charge for reupholstering an existing piece within the household. So now we've established the fact that Phyfe was making music stools, but of course, very little of Phyfe's furniture is labeled, so attribution has to be based on other factors, including construction details, the quality of the carving, looking at proportion, and in some instances, documented provenance. Each of the stools in this group features a finely turned and molded crest rail with a lyre-form splat centering on 4 brass strings. Now, initially, one detail that stood out to me as I was looking at this was the turned crest rail, how it's a slight departure from what you would expect to see on a Phyfe lyreback klezmo side chair, that flat or slightly flared crest rail. But then literally yesterday, I stumbled across this image of a side chair with a similar, but not identical, but again, similar arrangement, which is why the internet is so amazing for doing furniture research. Now, going back to the stools, each of these stools features a round swivel seat whose height can be adjusted with an iron screw mechanism, similar to those that Allie discussed earlier. It also features 4 ring-turned and reeded tapering legs joined by an H stretcher. And you can see that sort of 5th leg that the iron screw mechanism goes down into. And they terminate in brass ball feet. Now, Nancy McClellan included an identical stool in her 1939 book, Duncan Fife and the English Regency. So that example is either a 4th stool of this group, or it's one of the stools that I previously mentioned during a time when it was under earlier ownership. Now, McClellan noted tantalizingly that only 4 of these are known, but she doesn't say anywhere else in her book about the other 3. So a future direction of my research is going to be to visit the archive at the Cooper Hewitt where her papers are located and hopefully find some clues about that. Because again, one of the things I'm very interested in is the provenance of these stools. McClelland also suggested, as Allie noted earlier, that these stools could also have been used at a dressing table, which is something that for this group requires a little more investigation, but especially since these have the backs on them. But that's another discussion for another time. As I mentioned earlier, Classical American Homes founder Dick Jenrette acquired our music stool at Sotheby's at a 1981 auction. Lot notes from the sale suggest that the consignor, a New England private collector, had acquired it from Manhattan dealers Ginsberg and Levy, and their source was an earlier Sotheby Park Bernay sale in 1972. That's unfortunately as far back as I'm able to go on its provenance at the present time, the perfect example of how the pandemic has put some aspects of research projects on hold until a point where I'm able to visit a repository and access a copy of that earlier 1972 auction catalog and hopefully be able to take the path back a little further. The stool at Winterthur was acquired by H.F. DuPont and was actually published in Charles Montgomery's catalog of federal period furniture at Winterthur as well, seen here. Now, in addition to this group of music stools that I'm focusing on for this project, there are several other piano stools attributed to Fife that I want to briefly mention. This first example is in Colonial Williamsburg's collection. You saw it earlier in Allie's presentation as well. It features a lyre back, and a crest rail features a great carved motif of acorns and vines. The stool has small, slightly outcurving arms, and it's on a pedestal base with saber legs and carved paw feet on brass casters. Like many other types of furniture, the music stools attributed to Fife can be used to trace the evolution of his furniture styles through the first half of the 19th century. This slightly later example in the Metz collection dates to the 1830s or early 1840s. And by that time, Fife had brought his sons into the business, and the firm was known first as Duncan Fife and Sons, and later Duncan Fife and Son. Stylistically, you begin to see a reduction and then basically an absence of the finely detailed carving, the gilt brass applique, the stencil decor, and some of these other typical characteristics you see on the earlier furniture. And in its place, you find a leaner design that's interpreted in this amazing veined rosewood and crotch mahogany veneers, as well as scrolled supports, which really provide a dramatic effect. And I have to say, I've really gained an appreciation for this slightly later period of Fife shop since researching a number of the pieces at in the Classical American Homes collection, especially our pieces at Millford. And Fife, of course, wasn't the only New York cabinet maker producing music stools. The 1833 Joseph Meeks & Sons broadside in the Metz collection provides some clues about what one of Fife's competitors offered. Enlarged at right and circled there and left on the broadside you see are 2 different designs for rosewood piano stools depicted on the broadside, noted as costing $25 each. Last but not least is this extant music stool. It's sort of a Frankenstein piece, for a lack of a better term. While it's made of some Fife components, it's actually the work of later 19th century cabinet maker Ernest Hagen, who was actually a Fife copyist and early Fife scholar. The piece is discussed and illustrated in Deborah Waters' 1996 American Furniture article, Is It Fife? The music stool features the back, scroll, and lyre, what from what was probably a Fife side chair, except it's affixed to a different base, and some new carving was added to the crest rail by Hagen, and then it was sort of a coloring agent was added to antique it and make the color uniform. And it's stamped and dated by Hagen several times. Now, I should also say that while I'm on the subject of New York music stools, there's a second group that I encountered when I was doing some of this research. Again, I don't think these are attributable to Fife shop, but they're an interesting group that, you know, deserves some more investigation. I've spent a lot of time as I've been preparing for this presentation, scrolling through past auction lots on auction house websites and looking at examples of music stools that sold over the past 10 years, as well as looking at other museum collections, online catalogs, to see what sort of music stools are out there. And again, I kept running into several of this type that, again, are usually attributed to New York, and they feature a very low back and an upholstered seat with these dolphin carved side rails, which again is a sort of distinct characteristic of them. They, most of them are on a pedestal base. They feature, you know, slightly bulky legs and are that terminate in some variation of either a hairy paw, or I've even seen a couple of examples that are actually a hooved foot. Now, as usual with any research project, I think I've managed to raise more questions than answers, but it's a project that's turning out to be very fun. And as I said, my conversations with Allie have definitely influenced the way I'm thinking about this object and some of the other objects dealing with musical performance in the Classical American Homes collection. The particular group of music stools also shows that Fife's shop was clearly capable of producing some very sophisticated furniture forms. And again, you only have to look at some of those other extant invoices and the body of attributable Fife furniture to see that there are some other very specialized furniture forms that are out there. Last but not least, I want to mention that when Edgewater's Morning Room was featured on the cover of Antiques in January, February of 2012, the stool got a bit of a cover girl moment. You can actually see it there to the left, right there. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and I will turn it back over to Carrie.
Oh, sorry. Thank you all. That was great. Thank you both, Grant and Allie. I invite all of the panelists to please turn back on their cameras. I have a bunch of questions that have come in, and I'm just going to start in order of presentation. They're pretty specific so far. If anyone has a question they would like to ask all of the panelists, feel free to submit that in the chat as well. But Mary, I want to start by thanking you for participating, even though you're during your exams. That is a wild and ambitious task to take on. So thank you so much. And your research is fascinating. I have never thought maybe that completely about recreational horse racing. So the first question that you received is, in one of the last photos, there appears to be an African-American jockey. So I think in one of the last photos from your slide. And you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation that African-Americans were relegated to work on the stables. Do you know who that man was and why he was allowed to ride?
Good eye. Yes, so that man's name is Charlie Smoot, and he was first a steeplechase jockey for Marion DuPont Scott before he retired from that and then became her barn foreman. So it's pretty fascinating kind of the differences between steeplechase racing and flat racing. In flat racing, the jockey club basically banned African Americans from riding as jockeys like during the late 19th, early 20th century by preventing them from getting licenses. Same thing with trainers. They basically just made it impossible for people of color to get licensed to be able to ride. And then during races, white jockeys would actually gang up and like box in the black jockeys so they couldn't win or anything, and basically just like physically push them out of races. Sometimes made racing so dangerous that they couldn't do it. Steeplechase racing was a little bit different because they had a different governing body. And so like different steeplechase race committees at like individual locations would determine the rules for like who could or could not ride horses in the races. And so many of them also prevented black jockeys. But since like there were like kind of some loopholes, like Mary DuPont Scott was leading steeplechase owner, she was able to kind of throw her weight around and get it so Charles Smoot would be able to ride her horses in races. I mean, sometimes she'd actually like get letters saying that like he couldn't ride her horses, and then she just threatened to withdraw her horse from the race, which kind of was like kind of implied that like like this like leading owner was angry with the racing committee, and so she would get him to be able to ride in the races. But yeah, he was a very talented rider. He actually was in this one race. I guess it was like one of the big ones in New York, and he fractured his collarbone the day before the race, but he had such a good horse that he didn't want to withdraw, because being an African American, he had to be the best to be able to continue getting jobs and having these wealthy owners, push for him to be able to ride as a jockey. And so he rode in this race with a fractured collarbone. He broke the collarbone completely when the horse landed from a jump badly midway through the race. He had 6 jumps left. He put the reins in his teeth because his arm was completely immobilized, and rode the rest of the race, won it. And I mean, it's like, it's one of those instances where like, he basically was like taking that idea of like white elite masculinity, because he's in there riding against a lot of these gentlemen jockeys, and like, having this really high pain tolerance to like be able to like get through and, be like, you guys aren't superior. And like, challenging that through his own, demonstrations of sportsmanship. And so Mary DuPont Scott was like really impressed with his riding ability, and he had apparently had extremely good knowledge of horses. I've actually spoken to some people who worked for him, done oral interviews with them, and they said he was just this really impressive horseman. And so after he retired from being a jockey, he was her foreman, and basically, so he didn't like get a license as a trainer. I don't know why they didn't really decide to contest that when they contested him, the limitations on him being a jockey. But he was the barn foreman, and so he supervised all of her white workforce within the stables, and supervised the care of the horses, and basically oversaw the training of the horses on a day-to-day basis. So he basically kind of was a trainer without the licensure and that sort of thing, and was a key part of Mary DuPont Scott stables. And I think that there are actually, I've come across a few other African-American steeplechase riders and trainers and that sort of thing who worked for like the Clark family and some of these other top steeplechase owners. And so I went to do further research on them during my dissertation to like, find out the ways that they managed to become jockeys and like take on leading positions in the horse world, in spite of all of these massive barriers that like tried to push them out.
That's a wild story, and I'm kudos to you for tracking down all of that information on him and his racing. He sounds like an incredible figure.
Yeah.
I have a couple other questions for you, and then we'll move on to.
Sure.
So, did other Gilded Age equestrian communities develop in locations outside of Long Island in South Carolina?
Yeah. I've most extensively researched South Carolina and Northern Virginia for my research. Something somewhat similar happened with the Middleburg area and the Warrenton area, which is, kind of one of the centers of Virginia fox hunting and horse culture. And basically, I think during the 1890s, a bunch of elite Northerners from Orange County, the Orange County Hunt, came down to compete with Virginians. They were like trying to compare like which type of foxhound was the best. Apparently, they had 2 different types of foxhounds. And so the Northerners were so impressed with like Virginia hunt country that they all moved down there and like bought up a bunch of former Virginia plantation houses in some cases and just farms in the other, and like, developed them into other massive kind of sporting complexes around the Middleburg area and Warrenton. And then something somewhat similar happened down around Charlottesville. Like there are these pockets of, Gilded Age Northern elites who like developed these Southern houses where they would, ride and fox hunt and horse show and develop racing stables. And actually some of the South Carolinians, like Mary DuPont Scott, had her main training farm at Montpelier, which is where she like bred and trained her horses most of the year, except for when she was in South Carolina. And she would just ship her horses around by rail and then by automobile once the automobiles became, I guess, more reliable forms of transportation for horses.
And we have one more question that I'm sure a lot of people have on their minds, but how does this particular topic relate to your ongoing dissertation research?
Yeah, so my ongoing dissertation research, I'm like I said, interested in kind of this, horse racing and horse breeding as the production of race, class, and gender. And so I'm really interested in how a lot of these elites, especially like the Long Islanders, started partnering with ex-Confederates, Southerners, who lived in Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee, who were breeding thoroughbreds, kind of, I guess the leftover from like this antebellum horse culture, and how those two partnered together. Some of the families even intermarried, like the Keens over in Kentucky. And so I'm interested in kind of in how kind of that like race and like reconciliation kind of move forward, and then looking at how horse breeding is a form of eugenics practice. Basically the eugenicists used horse breeding records since racehorses, could reproduce every 4 years, or when they turned 4 years old, they could start having babies all the time. And so eugenicists would basically use track records of these horses and all the breeding pedigrees and lineages of these horses to like try and improve, that like basically you could breed anything to be pure and better and that sort of thing. Yeah, I know it's pretty some pretty dark, slightly twisted stuff, but yeah. And then also like eugenic practices with like sterilizing horses. For a while in the 1920s, they were kind of obsessed with like sterilizing female horses, which is really unusual because in the horse world, typically you only neuter the male horses because that's enough to like keep the equine population under control. And for a while they were like sterilizing female horses, and the connections of that to, sterilizations of women kind of during the American eugenics movement that was going on during the same period. I'm interested in like how these like circuits of knowledge kind of are interrelated.
No, I think it's fascinating and important research, and I'm glad that I don't have to read those primary source documents because they sound like they would be deeply troubling. So
they're deeply troubling.
Well, if anyone has any further questions for Mary, please let them submit them in the chat. And thank you again for taking this time, even though you are amidst what must be a mental chaos. So thank you. I also have a few questions next for Jeff. Boona, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that improperly, asks, what wood are the roof beams, joints, and etc. made from? It looks like chestnut, but can you speak a little bit about the dominant woods in South Carolina for those kinds of structures?
It looks like it's pine. I wouldn't swear on my life that it's pine, but pine is a likely choice. I suppose poplar might be another choice, but pine is very likely. Sometimes we see buildings that have pine uprights and oak sills. It's certainly not oak, but I think it's mostly pine. At least that's my memory.
And it seems like the Mannings left behind a pretty robust set of primary documents. What kind of things are you working with? Are they journals or?
So there's a whole series of letters, and I want to mention right away that we don't actually have direct access to those materials right now. They're in the Columbiana collection, which is not open to researchers at the moment because of the coronavirus. Although I say that a week ago it wasn't open to researchers. It may be by today, the way things seem to change. So I'm looking forward to getting into those, and we have some key members of staff who are going to be making that a priority once those are open to us. I will say I'm very grateful to Emily Johnson, who wrote her dissertation in part on Millford, and some of her research really informed what we do know about the stable, including she was able to provide to us the transcript of the specifications for the stable. So I'm very, very grateful to Emily for giving us access to that while we wait to get our hands on the originals. And I'm quite sure that there is a lot for us to discover in there. I'm really looking forward to seeing what's in those papers.
And I think a question that might be on everyone's mind, and I'm not sure you can fully answer right now, but is what your programming and educational plans are for the site moving forward.
Well, its remoteness is a factor for us. I don't think we ever imagine Williamsburg or Monticello or Mount Vernon levels of visitation to this site. My tongue was not in cheek when I said that there are not paved roads all the way to the doorstep of Millford. However, having said that, we do envision, and the plans for this are developing really as we speak, we do envision Milford becoming a very rich and vital educational center, both for the training of students in material culture and architectural history and in preservation and landscape studies, but also for people who are not necessarily on a career track, but simply have a kind of deep and abiding interest as amateurs or maybe as future professionals in the material world. So stay tuned, I think is what I'll say. I'll tease you with that. We do anticipate opening up the doors at Milford to people, many of the sorts of people that are watching this presentation right now in the not too distant future.
Great, and I hope everyone keeps an eye out for everything that Classical American Homes is planning, and I'm sure is going to announce very soon. So it's all very exciting.
Yes, yes, stay tuned.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Allie, I have a few questions that came through for you. I keep having to say giggle to myself before I say the name of your museum. It's Sigal Music Museum is new. Besides the piano stools, what kind of objects are in your collection?
So the museum's been open for just a few years. It is a brand new museum here in Greenville. The collection started based around about 40 to 50 keyboard instruments, but then in the fall or the summer of 2019, we received the entire collection of Marlowe A. Sigal, who was from Boston, and he passed away in 2018. So we absorbed all of those instruments. The collection is heaviest in keyboards and wind instruments. There's just around 100 keyboard instruments, a whole lot of pianos. We have like literal shelving of square pianos, if you can imagine that in your mind. And then there's 400, 500 wind instruments alone. It's quite a quantity. So I've had the privilege of probably looking at every single flute maker that has ever existed at every point in time. But it's been a real treat to get to go through and intake that collection and just see the huge expanse of craftsmanship and materials that are being used. So that's what our collection focuses on. And there are a couple string instruments as well. So we just recently opened our first exhibition that is highlighting this major collection. It's called Sensational Sigal, and it will be up for at least through the end of this year. So if you're in Greenville, come check it out.
I wish I could. You got another question from an anonymous participant. He says, Allie, you asked what a musical instrument is if it cannot play. Are you an advocate of restoring instruments in a museum setting to a playable state or leaving them inert for the sake of authenticity, quote unquote authenticity?
I'm really glad that someone asked that, because that is a question that we deal with on a daily basis, and especially right now because we are in the middle of a lecture series of our own called CSI Keyboards, which takes individual instruments and unpacks the different ways that we could go about either restoring or not restoring them. So really what it boils down to, it is a case-by-case basis. You can't make a blanket rule about what to do with an instrument. There's so many factors to take into account, if the instrument is one of a kind, if the instrument is really, really worn down, like how much material do you need to take away from it to bring it back to playing condition? There's so many things to think about, but a book I recommend on that subject is called Artifacts in Use, The Paradox of the Restoration of Organs by John Watson, who used to be the conservator and curator of musical instruments at Colonial Williamsburg. But it is a fascinating conundrum. And like I said, it's something that as a music museum, we think about all the time because we want to share the sound, but sometimes it's better to let the object be. And one thing that John does, and one of my colleagues, Tom Strange, does, they sometimes recreate instruments. So you're able to take, all the exact measurements, and you're using as close as you can. You can get pretty close with the materials. So you're recreating that historic object without having to harm the original. So that can give you, in some ways, an entree into understanding what that would sound like. But yeah, it's, like I said, case by case basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating issue, and I'm sure it would take more than a lifetime to record all of the instruments in your collection and how. Yeah. So the last question I have for you is, how can non-music museums incorporate music into their collections and programming?
So if it's a house museum, or if it's just a normal sort of general museum, there are a lot of ways that people could go about this. I mean, really, just for at least a house museum, you can focus on the stories of that family and their involvement in music. If they have musical instruments, great, you can use those. You can place recordings in the galleries. You can work with local musicians to bring some of these spaces to life through historical performance. There's so many opportunities to do it that would make a much more dynamic experience for a visitor, that are really accessible, I think, to most places. So, and then the same thing with a general museum. People don't know always what to do with musical instruments because they don't really fit anywhere. So they kind of get a little tucked into the sides of institutions or in back rooms and such. But they're great. They're multimedia objects, so they tell any story that you want them to tell. Like you can fit it in. But I think just finding ways to bring sound into the space is really critical in interpreting any musical instrument in any museum.
And I can't wait to go to a museum, let alone hear any kind of.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Allie. And I have a few more questions for Grant. So my first question for you, Grant, is how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted your research project?
I think, as Jeff has mentioned too about, limiting access to sources, I'm, running into the same issue, the ability to visit some of these other institutions to look at the objects that I mentioned in a non-COVID world would be a lot easier to do. But yeah, so I look very forward to a time once all this is behind us and we're not so limited in trying to for travel and everything for research. And I think we're all looking forward to a day where we can all, stroll through a museum gallery again, or do any of the things that, well, we would all in theory be in New York right now, enjoying all of the in-person benefits of Americana Week. So I think we all look forward to getting back to that at some point too.
Yeah, I agree. And the next question I have for you is, despite your piano stools cover girl moment, why do you think that these music stools in general have not garnered that much scholarly attention in the past?
That's a great question. I think, again, because they're such a specialized piece of furniture, I think they're not a, what's the term I'm trying to think of here? It's not a, it doesn't have a lot of sexy carving on it. It's not a wow kind of piece of furniture. And I think that's the reason. But again, it's definitely, as I started looking into these, and again, I started seeing again these other examples that are extant as well, got me to realize again, it's a very interesting form of furniture. And again, it's a very specialized form made for a very specific purpose, which might have limited its audience as well. And again, I'm curious to kind of see if there are more of this group I'm looking at than 4 examples. As I said, Nancy McClelland mentioned almost 100 years ago that only 4 of these are known, but are there more out there? So that's an interesting.
And that sort of leads into my last question for you, is where do you plan to take your research on piano stools, and what do you plan to do with all of this body of work that you've been building?
That's a good question. I don't exactly know right now, but I definitely, it's a project, like I said, I want to continue once, post-COVID, when some of the, visiting some of these other institutions and things is a little more feasible. Like I said, I'm very eager to get to the archive where Nancy McClellan's papers are, just to see if there's any sort of clues in there about, again, like I said, she mentions that, there are only 4 of these stools, but doesn't mention the other 3 and where they might have been at the time she was working on her project. But yeah, I think at least an article or something will probably come out of it. But
I know I would be interested in a book on piano stools. So whatever the Classical American Homes, whatever route they decide to take, I'm excited to see how it plays out. But thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been an exciting colloquium, and we were able to reach a larger audience than we usually get. So we are thrilled, and we cannot wait until next year when we can be together in New York. And I think Lauren will be joining us to close out our program. So
Thanks, Carrie. I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers from Classical American Homes. Allie and Mary, you are lights in our field, and you are the future of all of our work. So thank you for taking the time and joining us virtually today. Classical American Homes remains fully committed to inspiring and supporting the next generation of scholarship in our fields. And many thanks to Matt, Carrie, and Sarah of the Decorative Arts Trust for all of their work convening this colloquium. And I also wanted to recognize all of you, our audience, everybody out there who continues to support Classical American Homes during this transformative time for our organization. And I did just want to say, be sure to follow us on social media and sign up for our newsletter to receive our updates on what promises to be an exciting year. So thank you again for joining us, and I do hope that we can be together in person next year. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, audience.
Our founder, Dick Jenrette, called Millford his Taj Mahal. It's a spectacular Greek Revival masterpiece designed and built by a Rhode Island-born architect named Nathaniel Potter in 1840 for the Manning family of Sumter County, South Carolina. Our new team is assembled here to begin brand new investigations of the property, the collections, and we're especially interested in the original stable.
In addition to providing specs for the main house, the builder, Nathaniel Potter, also provided Manning with specs for the stable. It's an outbuilding, but it's an outbuilding, a dependency that's made to be seen.
This is a very carefully designed building. It's essentially a temple to horse racing. I think you'll recognize an echo of the Parthenon, an echo of a Greek temple with that shallow pitched roof, the classic fluted Doric columns. The attention to detail, its sort of cosmopolitanism is extraordinary. So what we're working on right now is trying to understand the roof. This building needs a new roof, so the question then becomes, what roof? Do we simply put on another asphalt shingle roof? And if our focus in this organization was simply the maintenance of these buildings, that would be a reasonable choice, and it would be an inexpensive choice. That's not what we want to do. This organization is committed to caring for our buildings as well as it can be done.
Preservation is not merely maintaining a structure. Preservation means intentionally choosing the best and most historically accurate path possible for a building.
Jeff and I have been measuring in between principal rafters, trying to find cut nail patterns to determine the original roof.
Specifications written in 1839 suggest that it should be wood shingled, but when we look at the sheathing at the underside of this roof, we see not enough nails, not enough historic nails for it to have been shingles in 1840. That suggests that this was a metal roof rather than a wood shingled roof. These buildings reveal themselves over time, and the closer we look, the more we learn about this building. So an important part of doing this work is ensuring that we have as complete and as detailed a record of this building as we can possibly get. And we get that using 2 contemporary tools. One is 3-dimensional laser scanning, which will allow us to have a 3D computer model of the building. The other is a model that's built up through photographs, and a photographic model will allow visitors to our website to look all around the stable. So it'll make this building newly accessible to a worldwide audience.
Working in a structure like this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
This structure is such a rare survivor, not only in our state, but in the country. And it deserves the level of care, attention, and investment that we have long lavished on the main houses at our properties.
The stable is just now starting to teach us its secrets. Through studying the original documentation, through exploring the structure, and through engaging the latest and cutting-edge preservation technology, we hope to learn the full story that this building has to tell. It's 160 years old, but at the end of this process, we expect to know it as if it were brand new. It's an exciting process for Classical American Homes. We appreciate your support from the past. We hope you'll fully engage in supporting this effort today, and we look forward to your ongoing support tomorrow.